Hello and welcome to Virtual Monsterama 2020. My name is Darren Bush. I am one of the co-directors of the literature track and of the media track here this year. And we are going to be bringing to you for the next hour the panel. I've got it right here. I promise I know what it is. Did Mary Shelley invent science fiction? And the answer is actually more interesting than a yes or no answer. Before we get into that topic, I'm going to let our esteemed panelists introduce themselves this morning. I'm going to start with Ellie. Ellie, if you'll please introduce yourself to our wonderful Monsterama audience.
Okay. Hi, I'm Ellie Rain. I am the author of the award-winning fantasy series, The Necrosine Chronicles. I write about magic, reapers, and demons.
Excellent. James?
I am James Palmer. I write science fiction and pulp adventure. I wrote the Shadow Council, four novellas in the Shadow Council Archives series. I've also written a couple of space opera novels, The Star Swarm and Ix Incursion.
Excellent. And you guys, some of you have heard me say this before already, but I'm Darren Bush. I'm also a science fiction and fantasy author. I also run and create a lot of panels for local Atlanta science fiction and fantasy conventions, like Monsterama, of course. I just want to let everybody know, because we're virtual this year, you are watching this video at your convenience. But for those of you familiar with the concept of the Hangover panel, we are recording this panel ridiculously early in the morning on the weekend. So for us, technically, this is the Hangover panel. So we will see how much fun we have here. So I just want to start by talking about the fact that there is a great deal of argument on the interwebs about Mary Shelley and her role in creating science fiction, and there is some good argument that she that she started science fiction officially. Well, maybe unofficially. Anyway, that's the whole point of this discussion: is does she get that? Does she earn that credit or not? So I want to start with, for those of you who don't know, we're talking about the novel Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. Modern Prometheus was the subtitle that she put on the book. So let's start by talking about the book. I'm going to put James on the spot here. James, what was your first exposure to Frankenstein? And I'm talking about in any media.
Gosh, even before I read the book in college, and even before then, I mean, Frankenstein was all over pop culture with Universal horror movies, and there was a movie that came out in the '80s called Frankenstein Unbound, based on, I think it was Brian Aldiss novel. And the Bride with Sting and Jennifer Beal. So I had seen all that stuff before I read the book. So I mean, Frankenstein's everywhere. Every Halloween, giant blow up things of Frankenstein and Frankenstein art, Frankenstein comics, just everything.
Mm-hmm. Ellie, how about you? What was your first exposure to Frankenstein?
Do you guys remember a show called Scrappy Doo?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that was kind of my first exposure to that. So there was like a movie marathon special for Scrappy Doo on Halloween, October special. And like I must have rewatched those movies so many times because we bought them on VHS. So like all I remember is, you had like the little girls and the little like school for girls for monsters or something like that. So Scrappy Doo had to like help these three monster girls along their adventures to stop an evil sorceress and everything. So one of them was like a mummy girl, one of them was a vampire girl, and the other one was like a Frankenstein girl. That was my first introduction to that, was a cartoon. And then you got the actual, like black and white movie is what my parents showed me later on when I was older. And then the best one was pretty sure this was a Mel Brooks movie.
Young Frankenstein?
Young Frankenstein.
That's the one. Sorry,
Yeah.
it's so early.
Oh, no, Young Frankenstein is an amazing interpretation of not just that story, but of other stories kind of mixed in together. I'm finding out because of Monsterama this year. My first exposure to Frankenstein was probably similar to James's, where it was just there, Halloween decorations in elementary school and costumes, Halloween, and it was later that I found out that there were, there were always horror movies, and as a kid I was not a fan of horror movies, and so I don't remember the first time I read the novel. But obviously, I had read the novel after being exposed to, the Scooby-Doo version and some of the movies, and I read the novel and I was like, this has nothing to do with all of that.
Yeah.
This is so different from the way it is depicted in the movies, if nothing else. The novel is very different. I was very interested in it. As I've said before on here, I was raised by a couple of science nerds, science fiction nerds, and science nerds. So my enjoyment of that novel included all of the sciencey stuff and the medical stuff and all of that. And the thing that got me the most was the realization that Frankenstein is not the name of the monster.
I know.
Which is still, all these years later, is still a running gag. It's, wait, what? The monster's name is not Frankenstein? And so, but just to really quickly sum up this introduction, one of my favorite interpretations of Frankenstein is Phil Hartman on Saturday Night Live. If you have not seen Phil Hartman do Frankenstein on Saturday Night Live, pause, go look it up on YouTube and look at it, because it is hysterical. It's not accurate to the novel, but it is accurate to the pop culture version of Frankenstein. And he does such a good job of playing the character and making it, of inserting it into these comedic moments. Anyway, so Frankenstein is one of those things that's just soaked into the culture. He and his monster are icons of our culture and of our language, and to the point where you can make joking references to it, and people kind of know that you're talking about Frankenstein. They get the joke in that way, which I think is fabulous, because it is a really, really good novel. It is one of those novels where I absolutely recommend everybody read it. The other good thing is that if you can get your hands on one of the audiobook interpretations of the novel, unabridged, always unabridged, fabulous. It's a fabulous listen too. So there was, you know what, there was one other thing I wanted to say about the novel before we get to talking about Mary Shelley. Is one of the cool things about the Frankenstein novel is that there's not it's all, a lot of it is second or third hand information. A lot of it is in documentation. It's not the traditional narrator sitting on your shoulder telling you a story kind of thing. So even its construction and even the way she tells the story is fascinating through all of these different second and third hand accounts. Anyway, okay. So do either of you want to comment on Frankenstein or the novel before we move on?
You summed up what I was going to say.
Oh, I'm sorry. I will try not to do that. Try not to do that too many times.
Oh, no, man, you said it way better.
Okay, so how many of us have trouble placing the novel in history? I will put my hand up first, because what I'm asking is, are you ever shocked when you find out how old the novel is? I am constantly shocked by that. James, do you remember what year it was published in? Do you know what I'm talking about? You're muted, sir.
Was it? Yeah, I can't remember. Was it? It wasn't 1898, was it? That's something else I'm thinking of.
Ellie, did you want to guess, Ellie, or did I already tell you earlier?
I mean, I had guessed the 1800s before you told me the answer, so like I'm gonna be like, yeah, that was kind of close, right?
We know that it's 18 something, but Frankenstein was published in 1818.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So this is almost 100 years before what you traditionally think of as kind of the beginning of science fiction as a genre, which we will get into in a few minutes. Shelley, she was born in 1797. I did not know that. I'm looking at Wikipedia right now. Wikipedia saves the day every time. And so she published Frankenstein 202 years ago. So this is one of the, for the math nerds out there, this is a palindrome anniversary. It was 202 years ago this year. And so, yeah, I'm one of those people that for some reason I think that she was a contemporary of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and those sorts of folks. No, almost 100 years later, or more than 100 years later, she beats them to the punch a lot.
Yeah, at least by several decades. There's
Mm-hmm.
30 or 40 years in between her and even Wells and Verne.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So really, what I'm really getting at here is that she. Well, let me just ask you guys the question. Do you agree with the concept? Do you agree with the statement that Mary Shelley invented science fiction? James, what about you? How do you feel about that question?
I think yes and no. One of the things that struck me about when I finally read the novel after seeing all the movies and stuff in popular culture about Frankenstein is she doesn't really go into the mechanics of how he was created. There's no lightning, electricity. She doesn't go into that stuff. I think that would make it more science fiction, but her ideas in it are science fiction, and you can only talk about this kind of stuff she was talking about in a science fiction novel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Ellie, how do you feel about giving her credit for inventing sci-fi?
I mean, I guess it kind of depends on whether or not you think that alchemy is technically science way back when, because it was all this stuff was considered magic at the time, you know? So, you know what they say, like magic is just science that hasn't been discovered. So like necromancy, chimeras, alchemy, that stuff definitely predates Mary Shelley, but it was all called and considered magic. So, you know, it wasn't called science. So, I mean, well, like you can definitely see some derivatives of that in her work. I think, like, I could be totally wrong because, you know, I'm not really a history expert, but I mean, I think this might be the first time it was not seen as magic so much as, wow, you know, we have electricity now. Maybe this could happen, you know?
I think the thing that's interesting is that she does approach it, at least in my opinion, she does approach this as a medical process. He is a doctor of medicine, at least the equivalent of the time. I mean, we are talking the early 19th century. So Frankenstein is as much a doctor of medicine as they had back then. There's a lot of hinting in his schooling and everything that he was way ahead of the curve, really gifted and talented, and that his desire, his very kind of Freudian desire to fix some things, led him to sneak off on his own and do some stuff that his teachers and his peers considered to be taboo or impossible or whatever, but he went ahead and did it anyway. I think that in and of itself leans toward it being what we would now consider science fiction, is that she's taking the technology and the technology and the knowledge, the science of the day, and taking it just the next step along to create a situation that kind of disturbs us, that forces us to think about things differently. And again, this harkens back to something that we give a lot of credit to Star Trek for, couching political and emotional and psychological discussions in these alien terms, so that it kind of sneaks up on you that there's a morality play going on. I think Frankenstein is a great little morality play. I won't pretend to understand it, because the culture of the early 19th century, I don't know much about it at all. But I do think that she qualifies as being a science fiction writer, even if the term didn't exist, even if that wasn't something in her mind at the time. But Ellie, you bring up a good point, which is we've had these sort of pseudosciences for thousands of years, essentially. Alchemy is a great example. We were talking earlier about how I consider alchemy to be part of the evolution toward chemistry and psychiatry and those sorts of things. So I don't discount alchemy as being, you know, wasteful or stupid or anything derogatory like that. I think it was a natural progression. I think that some of the stuff that's in Shelley's book, medical doctors now would go, oh, that's so cute. But yeah, they've had 200 years to figure that out. I mean, they've gone a lot further. So let's do this real quick. Is there, now of course we could do a whole panel on this one question, but the short version is, how do you personally define science fiction? Can we agree on what the definition of science fiction is?
I don't think anyone can agree on that, to be honest.
I am perfectly.
I feel like the jury's out, mostly because, like, you know, some people, depending on the work, could say that science fiction is the possible future, and then some would argue it's the impossible future. So you kind of got these two thoughts on the same genre, but it just doesn't really. They're just so different from each other, because maybe one is the possible future, but then these are like a separate category of definitely impossible that we're just going to make things up because it's fun. It's just, they're just so different. I'm not really sure if we, like, I see why we have subcategories and subgenres now, because there was probably a lot of disagreement on what defined the single parent genre, because every work side by side is just so different from what they're trying to accomplish. You can't compare apples and oranges.
That's a good point. James, what about you? How do you and I know you've published science fiction. How do you explain sci-fi?
Yeah, I've never really come up with my own pat definition. I think Ellie's right. It depends on the writer. It depends on what you're trying to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the future. I think if you just take one idea that's speculative, even in the present day, like cloning or something. I finally watched the movie Gemini with Will Smith last night, and it's an action adventure, kind of government hitman story with a clone in it, and it talks about the ethics of doing stuff like that and things, which is very science fiction, but in a present day action adventure, political thriller kind of setting. I think it's, I think it was Damon Knight that used to say, science fiction is what I say when I point at a thing, which is kind of silly, but and a little flippant. But
it's interesting.
It's John Campbell used to say about it that a science fiction story should be just like you're reading something out of the newspaper for that day, and say, oh, we have rocket ships, and don't explain it. Just we have this technology, and this is how we use it. So yeah, I don't really have my own definition, because I jump all over the place in the genre anyway, and kind of meld genres together.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like look at Black Mirror as an example right now. Like,
oh yeah, that
is freakily in the realm of the possible future for us right now, as we know, because they had an episode about android bees to collect honey. Guess what they are currently making in real life? Android bees to collect honey. That is scary, dude. That is terrifying, because we can clearly see that it is directly connected, and this could be a very possible thing, because hackers are all over the place. Ugh, it's creepy.
It's too early in the morning for killer bees, Ellie, I think. You both make very good points, and I think this is part of why I love debating about what is science fiction and what's not, because it almost becomes a personality test. You can learn a lot from a fiction or genre author by asking them, okay, what's science fiction, what's not science? It's like a Rorschach test. My answer is very much very inclusive, which again, also for me, a Rorschach test, because I compare science fiction to fantasy because to me, the definition of science fiction is essentially the same as fantasy, except the one thing you need in order to make it speculative is based in technology. It's a
Yeah.
science thing or a medicine thing or a physics thing or a computer thing, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm inclusive. And you take that one thing, like we have robots. Okay, we make robots into bees, and then we set them out to go gather honey. Then what happens? What are the consequences? To me, that's science fiction. I think it's easy to say that science fiction is that very large bubble that fantasy is not in. And that to me helps it make sense, because then really changing history is part of sci-fi, changing the future is part of sci-fi, messing with today like Black Mirror does. There's, I forget what it was, there was a movie. What movie was it? It literally started with the placard "about a day from now." I wish I
Oh,
could remember. There's a science fiction movie that's what
great.
it says. The movie starts tomorrow, which is one of the most frightening elements of that film, is that they're claiming that this is about to happen, like, so you sleep, come back tomorrow and we'll destroy the world. It's a great little tidbit of poking the science fiction definition and the genre. I also think that we do absolutely have really obvious subgenres within science fiction. Space opera and things called hard science fiction, all that stuff. So personally, don't care. I'm willing to let everybody kind of get on the bandwagon here. As soon as you start casting spells or rely on something supernatural, I put that into fantasy, and
Yeah,
I'm
no,
fine with that.
I accidentally made some of my magic science by accident. Um, I found out yesterday that there are such a thing as time crystals.
Yes,
So
and Ellie gave
yeah,
me homework. I had to go look that up. It's a theoretical construct in physics.
and like I'm sitting here, I'm kind of like, oh, I kind of accidentally did that. I'm gonna claim that I knew this. Yeah, I knew that. Okay.
All right, so you heard it first here on Monsterama that Ellie is claiming to be
Yeah,
psychic.
that was a weird thing. So technically, I guess in some instances, magic can become science. It's just undiscovered science.
Oh, we could do a whole panel on that too. All right, so excellent. Anything else about that before we move on? All right, so what we're going to do then is let's put Mary Shelley's Frankenstein back into those definitions. I'll just ask point blank, do you think Frankenstein is a science fiction novel? I think I've already said yes.
Yes.
James, what about you?
Yes, because of the ideas and concepts that she deals with, and very ahead of her time either way.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think it falls firmly in the realm of science fiction. I don't think it really works as fantasy either, because they don't really
Yeah.
say, they don't describe, she doesn't describe the science, but she doesn't really say magic either. She doesn't say, he didn't
Yeah.
No.
he
But
didn't
the
cast
thing,
spells or read
yeah.
about alchemy or none of that stuff.
But the themes that she produced is like right out of a Michael Crichton thing today.
Oh
You
yeah,
know, like, it's very much like, okay, do AI have rights? Does a
right.
creation that we made have rights?
Mm-hmm.
And like that's the concept that she was bringing up. So that's absolutely science fiction right there.
There's a lot of medical ethics stuff that we're just now having to deal with because we can clone,
Mm-hmm.
and because of um, just genetic, not even cloning, but just genetic engineering in general, and gene therapies and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, and as I think I said before, there's not a single whiff of supernatural anything in the text of Frankenstein. One of the things that I'm hoping we'll cover in a future panel here at Monsterama is that she doesn't specifically go into she as the narrator doesn't tell us her feelings on how souls work, and Dr. Frankenstein doesn't cover it, and Adam doesn't get into it as far as I remember. So there is that kind of cultural assumption from the author that you will understand like what the normal feeling is on how souls work, and that's the only supernatural element that I can think of that even is involved in this story, and she doesn't mention it explicitly. So again, it's all medicine and processes and surgery and parts instead of spirits or energy or something like that. So excellent, great. So what I want to do now then is we've hit the halfway point here on our time, give or take. So what I want to do is talk about the other half of the question, which is if you, like, let's take Mary Shelley off the board, okay? We'll put her back, I promise. But let's take Mary Shelley off the list here. Who is the second candidate on the list for the inventor of science fiction? What's the
Nicholas Flamel?
Nicholas Flamel?
Maybe, right?
The real life alchemist?
I mean, he wrote notes about it, right? He wrote notes on his findings, his research, correct?
I believe so. I think that's how we know about him.
So, like, his goal was to find a way to chemically turn things into gold, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And in the process, he found some other things that had reactions in different ways. It wasn't gold, but it did other things, and he wrote those down because, you know, it was a very scientific method.
Well, it's very interesting you say that, Ellie. I would not consider him to be a fiction writer, though.
Right.
I would consider him to be a scientist even before the word existed.
That's the other thing, though. At what point? So, like, have we found out a way to chemically turn things into gold? Have we found that out yet?
Well, let's go back a second and explain for the audience what we're talking about. No, just for reference, because I agree with you, but I think we skipped a couple of paragraphs here. The science of alchemy is, as I said before, is what I think of as leading up to chemistry and physics and other things. It's part of our evolution as understanding science. But the holy grail of alchemy was turning lead into gold because, and I'm sorry, I forget which chemical it is, but there's a chemical that if you mix gold with this chemical, it turns it into lead. There's a way to alter gold to make it go backwards to lead. What alchemy wanted to do, for obvious reasons, was they wanted to turn lead back into gold. And I'm pretty sure we've proven that it doesn't work that way at all. They were never going to get that to work within the frame of alchemy.
But if it did work, would we consider that fiction? If it did work, then it would become nonfiction.
Well, no, but you bring up an excellent point, which is Flamel, is he fictionalizing this
right
because it's completely not true, or is he a scientist making mistakes, but he just doesn't know that they're wrong yet?
Right, and like if we don't have anything like that today that I know of, I could be wrong. I'm gonna ask my husband if there's such a thing. He's a biochemist, so.
Well, is Stephen Hawking a science fiction author because his theories on black holes, some of them were proven to be incorrect? I
think it will just depend on whether or not we find out if it's possible. If it does suddenly become possible, his stuff is nonfiction. If it's still not possible yet at this point in time, it is still fiction, probably.
All right, so this doesn't happen very often, but Ellie just made my head go.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That was awesome. That is not where I was going, but that's why we do these panels, because that's awesome. That's great. Okay, so we'll have to come back. We'll have to come back to that. I will have to give that a think. James, I want to know what your answer was to my original question, which was who's our second person to mention for inventing science fiction?
I think we have to go with H.G. Wells.
Okay. And why Wells?
Well, because he was, he writes kind of the first things that we think of as science fiction: an alien invasion, time travel, and even stuff that we kind of did later. That there's a story called The Land Ironclads about ironclad, basically tank warfare, nuclear war and things. He was writing about that stuff back in the very late 1800s. I think The Time Machine was around 1898 or so.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, so was War of the Worlds. But he was writing about, in War of the Worlds, he was writing about British colonialism. In The Time Machine, he was talking about the difference between the aristocracy and the working classes. And science fiction has always been used to talk about social issues like that. So yeah,
Yeah.
he's definitely, high on my list as one of the first, what we would know now as a science fiction writer.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The War of the Worlds, which I've read about 80 times, or listened to,
Yeah.
read or listened to the audiobook about 80 times, is a fabulous example of literal science fiction, of the strict literal definition of science fiction, which is that he talks about the astronomers and the current processes of what they've discovered about the surface of Mars and their current belief of the physics and the biology and the chemistry, and all of this stuff is the beginning of the book, and it's fabulous and it's accurate for the time. And then he takes it and goes, squish, there are things living on Mars and they're coming here to eat us. You can't get any science fictionier than that. It's perfect middle of the road science fiction. And yeah, and we're talking about 125 years ago, give or take. So well ahead of the curve. The other thing that I love about Wells is that he has, whether people know it or not, he's inspired just thousands and thousands of works of art over the last 100 years, and is still constantly inspiring new art forms and new artists, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a couple of his characters into. I used the Time Traveler in my Shadow Council Archives series.
Mm-hmm.
So he's been a big influence on me for sure.
Yeah,
Go ahead. The War of the Worlds. You said other forms of art. I always think of the Orson Welles Mercury Theater infamous radio play adaptation of War of the Worlds.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's 90 years old, 91 years old. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of Orson Welles' interpretation on radio of War of the Worlds. And famously, I'm still seeing on the internet, I'm still seeing people debate what actually happened. Because for those of you who don't know, there's this myth that Wells accidentally caused a national panic because people thought that it was a real news announcement that Martians had landed in New Jersey. And there's some people saying now that they have evidence that that's a made-up story, that somebody made that up, maybe Wells himself, for the publicity. And I'm like, now of course it's been 90-something years, so it's like there's no telling. Yeah. But I do know that War of the Worlds is.
There were some newspaper articles at the time. I don't know that it was a national panic. I think it was local. There were the people in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, that shot up the local water tower because they thought it was a Martian war machine, and they didn't have a sponsor before, Mercury Theater, and they got a sponsor after this in Campbell Soup. That became Campbell's Playhouse.
Excellent.
So and like I think the police showed up while they were taping it because it wasn't a popular show and people were listening to something else, and then changed the dial, and he did it to sound like it was like it was happening in modern day, and it was just a normal news broadcast.
Yeah, it's
really brilliant.
It is worth listening to. It is worth listening to once, even if you're not a huge fan. It's worth listening to so you get the cultural information, get the cultural perspective on it.
Yeah.
So Ellie, I'm going to put you on the spot here. How much do you know about Wells and his stuff? Did you want to contribute to this part of the conversation?
I've not read any transcripts or any books about it, but I have watched the recent and the older movies for that. I haven't listened to the audio drama that you're talking about. I'm calling it an audio drama. I don't know if they called it that back then. But
radio play.
Radio play, yeah. We know what you mean.
I've heard about it, so I know the story behind it. I've just not actually heard the story.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a listen. I would recommend it. Again, for just the historical perspective, but also if you a very strange grandchild of H.G. Wells is Buckaroo Banzai, the movie from the 80s, where they lampooned the heck out of the fact that Orson Welles, his radio drama was actually real. And the lectroids had covered it up and made him go back and say that it was a fake radio program when it was real, because they really did invade Grover Mills, New Jersey in 1929. It's just the whole movie is premised around the fact that Orson Welles was telling the truth and was forced to lie later about it being,
I
hey, it
never
just,
made that connection.
yeah, it
Never
is,
made that connection.
yeah. And the fact that Buckaroo Banzai is essentially a grandchild of H.G. Wells, I'm totally cool with that. I love that. So what about, so who else, and I do have an answer in mind, who else do you think of when you think of the very beginnings of science fiction?
Verne. Jules
Yeah,
Verne.
Jules Verne. I did a little bit of research on this, very, very small amount of research on this, and one of the correspondents made a very interesting point, which is that Jules Verne did the labor, he did the groundwork to make science fiction a genre. Right? Now, I am not a huge fan of everything having to fit into the little pockets for marketing and publication and advertising, whatever. Not a huge fan of that. I know that's the reality of publishing, especially nowadays. But it just was interesting to me that the point this person made was that Jules Verne made a genre for that stuff to go into, because before that it was like I don't even know what how they would have marketed or sold, say, H.G. Wells. They might have done it as like an action adventure and just kind of let people figure out that there were space aliens in it. So James, tell us about Jules Verne here.
Well, he was kind of, him and Wells get contrasted a lot. I've heard people say that Verne was kind of the boy's adventure, while Wells was more about the idea. Verne was more, he would go into how these things worked. He spent time explaining how Captain Nemo's Nautilus worked, and the one about the balloon. He's got a couple of Nemo stories in there, and just the diving suits and all that stuff. He wanted that to sound plausible, and I think it got a lot of people thinking that, hey, we could really build a submarine, and we have submarines now, and submarine warfare, and it's a very common thing. But back then, it was, go to the bottom of the ocean, you're crazy. That was as crazy back then as going to the moon, and we've done both of those things. And just I used Captain Nemo in my first Shadow Council Archives novel, because I think he's an interesting and enigmatic character. We don't know a whole lot about him, which I find intriguing. We don't even really know his name. His name is Latin for nobody. So, but yeah, he worked on the mechanics of, how does this stuff work?
Yeah, he was in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I should say very briefly that we're actually doing an anniversary of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea panel here at Monsterama this year, later in the weekend, which I'm really looking forward to. But in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he spends a great deal of time talking about the submarine itself and the technology itself. If you've read, now I jokingly refer to Mysterious Island as the sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and if you've read it, you know what. Yeah, if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
No spoilers, but the Mysterious Island is this action adventure, right? These guys from the Civil War escape a prison camp, and they get in a balloon, and the balloon goes like 7,000 miles, which is the fiction part of science fiction. But they land on this island, and so most of the rest of the book is a treatise on how to survive on a deserted island with no tools. They literally tell you exactly how they built everything, including water reclamation. They start growing food of their own. They build defenses. They build weapons. They just engineer the heck out of it. They I think they forge iron, right? They find iron deposits, and they go through the whole thing. It's like there's this part in Moby Dick where he spends about 80 pages talking about whales and whaling, and I think technically you could skip that section and go back to the story, but Mysterious Island kind of has that element to it. It is very science. It is the absolute best physics, chemistry, and science of the day, and he uses it to prove that these handful of survivors were able to feed themselves, defend themselves, and build a house out of a cave. It's incredible. It's a great book. If you can play along with how important it is that they go the details of their survival, which are incredibly authentic. Yeah, it's an amazing story. And so Vern, absolutely, Vern does put a lot more science in his science fiction, and I think that the description of the kind of boy's adventure story, I'm thinking about Journey to the Center of the Earth, which I rewatched a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, yeah, it's very much a 15-year-old boy has an adventure with some adults who know what they're doing. Thank goodness.
Oh yeah.
So good stuff. Ellie, anything to throw in about Jules Verne here?
I only know the name, to be honest. Didn't know what he wrote, but when I heard the, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I was like, oh, I've seen that movie.
Mm-hmm.
Or did I see a parody of that movie? I don't know the difference anymore. Everything just kind of blends together.
Well, Disney did a movie back in the, I don't know when that was, back in the, I guess, late 60s, early 70s, something like that. And there've been other remakes. There's I think there's one with Richard Crenna in it.
Probably.
That I've got on DVD. I haven't watched it yet.
Yeah.
But and a lot of them will show Captain Nemo as kind of a white guy in like a Navy uniform, but no, he was Indian.
Yeah.
Possibly royalty. That's all we kind of get.
Yeah.
And in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, I think they portrayed him pretty well. The movie's terrible, but I think he was portrayed pretty well in that.
Yeah.
Pretty close to what Verne had envisioned.
Yeah, it's so Ellie. I'm not trying to embarrass you, but you nailed it on the head there, which is Jules Verne is another one of those science fiction authors that you've seen movies based on his work. Everybody has, whether it's called Jules Verne's whatever or not. Because 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is was it Kirk Douglas? Was he in that? Am I got that right?
Yeah, that's
that
the Disney
movie,
one.
Yeah, and that movie is incredibly well done for the technology of the age. It still holds up. It's a beautiful visual piece of art, and it's a great interpretation.
The Nautilus looks cool.
Nautilus looks great.
Very iconic.
But also, the the Journey to the Center of the Earth story I'm talking about stars Brendan Fraser. Right, so they're moving this forward.
I like that one.
Okay,
I do. I like that one.
Yeah.
I thought I was running into another thing where I guess I just saw a recent one. I'm sure there was an original one that they're talking about.
Oh
They made a sort of sequel too. They did Journey to the Mysterious Island, with 2 being the number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And they go to this island and there's giant bees, and it's the Rock is in that one. But it's
I've seen
good.
that one too. Wow,
yeah, they're both good.
Wow, this is weird for me. I've seen these movies you're talking about. Okay.
And one of the reasons that I love all of these interpretations from Disney all the way up until so I would honestly include Disney's Atlantis movies in the Jules Verne inspired grandchildren conversation.
That movie.
Because if that submarine isn't based on the Nautilus, I will eat my headset. Okay, it's the Nautilus, guys. It really is. It's a gorgeous interpretation of what some people would call steampunk. Personally, I would call it Verne punk, because they're reinterpreting. That. Thank you. They're reinterpreting Jules Verne's original written words into this gorgeous visual interpretation of the tone that he was going for. Right. So I personally like the first Atlantis movie. The science is really not. But the interpretation of Verne's art and tone and everything is, I think, beautifully portrayed in this Disney animation.
Yeah. And the movie didn't do well, but it's a good movie.
I think it is.
It really is.
Yeah. There are moments in Atlantis where I think a lot of parents were like, okay, my small child doesn't get this whole act.
Yeah.
Right. The betrayal and the politics and the suggested genocide and everything was way over some of the kids' heads. But I thought it was really well done. I think that it is another one of those shows that proves that Verne is one of the fathers of science fiction, one of the parents of science fiction. Another interpretation I want to mention very quickly before we get to the end of this paragraph is that I have found Patrick Stewart's interpretation of Captain Nemo in
Oh,
in the movie called Jules Verne's Mysterious Island. I think it was I don't know if it was a Hallmark movie, but it was like a made-for-TV movie. Kyle MacLachlan plays the hero. Patrick Stewart plays Captain Nemo. Um, and of course he doesn't, like, they didn't make him up to suggest that he looked Indian, so that part didn't come in. But he did a very good job of being this kind of the world hates me, therefore I hate the world. I'm not going to help you people. Go get out of my compound and go deal with the giant wasps yourself. He did a very good job of being this kind of angry, bitter Captain Nemo, who was also brilliant and talented and resourceful. So I definitely would recommend watching that one for some of the interpretations of Verne's work.
yeah, that sounds awesome. I love Patrick Stewart. I loved
Oh
his A
yeah,
Christmas Carol. I'll have
yeah,
to check. I'll have to seek that one out and check it
yeah.
out.
One of the best things that ever happened to us because of Star Trek: The Next Generation is Patrick Stewart is allowed to do whatever he wants and it's good.
Yeah,
His I mean his Captain Nemo is, again, doesn't look like an Indian, but does a very good job with all the other aspects of it. James, you mentioned League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Yeah, I think they totally got Nemo.
yeah,
Visually, the
definitely.
tone, the kind of, like, he's amazing, but he's scary. He's
Yeah,
not a heroic figure.
no,
He's not. He's really kind of scary, and they captured that perfectly. In a movie that made a huge amount of mistakes, they got that right. So I give them
yeah,
credit for that.
yeah,
Yeah. So Ellie, I guess where we're going with this is, yeah, you've seen Jules Verne's stories in various places, even if you didn't
Apparently
recognize him.
so. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is kind of why it's so obvious that he needs to be included in this conversation. Because
Hmm.
we've all seen works that were inspired by Jules Verne, just like H.G. Wells. Okay, so before we go back to the main topic here, is there anyone else that I'm missing or skipping that needs to be mentioned as far
Should,
as the
should we
origins of science
mention?
fiction?
Oh, should we not mention Mary Shelley herself, like her life story?
We'll come back. We'll come back to Mary Shelley in just a second. But I'm like, Wells and Verne are obvious. I want to quickly throw in Edgar Allan Poe.
I was going to mention Poe if you
Thank
didn't.
you. Okay, I
Yeah,
appreciate that. I'm sorry, I should have let you do it.
no, that's
Uh,
okay.
James, go ahead and tell us why you think Poe should be on the list.
Um, he wrote a lot of kind of what we would think of now as horror. I guess there's a lot of kind of phantasmagoric stuff, but
Mhm.
he did some science fictiony stuff too. There was, I think, 5 Weeks in a Balloon. There's other short stories
Yes.
that I probably haven't read or have read years ago in college or something. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym,
Hmm.
which was unfinished before his death. I read that in college too. Rocky, sorry, my dog, he's getting the eggs. He didn't, but he almost did. Um, the um, yeah, narrative Arthur Gordon Pym is about a guy that gets all this crazy, bizarre stuff happens to him. He gets shipwrecked. There's a scene with like this plague ship. All these
Hmm.
guys are just dead from some kind of plague on the ship, and they're all just yellow and just disgusting. And then he ends up uh, in the in Antarctica, I
Uh-huh.
think.
Yep.
And there's like an opening to the center of the Earth, and then that's kind of where it ends. So he was kind of trying to do a Verne kind of journey to the center of the Earth kind of thing,
Yeah.
Poe
Yeah.
style.
And Arthur Gordon Pym had a fanfic that was written later called "At the Mountains of Madness" by H.P. Lovecraft. It was Arthur Gordon Pym was Lovecraft treated that like the prequel to his story,
Yeah,
because Pym was referred to in at the beginning of "At the Mountains of Madness."
yeah.
So it's
And Lovecraft is definitely science fiction as
absolutely,
much as he is horror.
yeah.
Horror is the tone. Science fiction is the, I guess, window dressing.
Yeah, and I hate to break it to the fantasy folks, but Lovecraft himself said that Cthulhu is a science fiction element. That he's an alien,
Yeah.
not a magical creature.
All of his stuff was. He didn't write about vampires or werewolves. He wrote
No,
about these these
yeah,
extraterrestrial gods.
yeah. So Poe is also a great example. And James, for I think you mentioned it, is there's this one short story where this person is like bored to death and they're writing a letter to someone who'll never get the letter. And the descriptions that he gives of the airship that he's on, that
Yeah.
it has 6,000 passengers or something crazy like that, and that there's an even bigger one about a mile above him, that's science fiction.
Oh, yeah.
He's taking the current technology of dirigibles, airships, things like that, and he's just taking it to an extreme that humanity never actually reached. It wasn't because we couldn't reach it. We decided to go in a different direction. I
Right.
miss dirigibles. I love them. But this
Yeah.
thing, I mean, think about it. Think about a Goodyear blimp that can hold 6,000 people comfortably.
Yeah.
And the thing must just be ginormous. And he doesn't go into any technical details. He just refers to it as a thing that's just normal,
Yeah.
which harks back to something that, John
Yeah.
Campbell would have
I
liked.
think I think these days, if you have technology in science fiction, like if you're up in a spaceship and you don't actually say how the technology works, things just go pew pew. Then they call that space opera, because it's more
Yeah.
focused on the story and the journey that the characters take, rather than focusing so much on how the technology works. And then hard science fiction, they would say, like, oh, we're going to go into explicit detail on how everything works. These phaser beams are going to be like super exact.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I am looking at the clock and realizing that we're heading toward running out of time here. I apologize, but let's Ellie, you wanted to circle back to Mary Shelley. Did you want to quickly let us know what you were thinking about?
I just wanted to generally talk about her life as like kind of like a parallel between that and the story she wrote, and how it connects together, and you can kind of clearly see why she wrote this story and why everything just sounds so authentic
Mm-hmm.
in its, I guess, misery, the tone of
Did you?
misery.
Yep. So we've got a couple of minutes here. Did you want to try and tackle that, or did you want me to do the summation that I found?
Go ahead and do the summation. It's going to be way more accurate than anything I say.
Well, I'm only, again, Wikipedia is open on the other page, which is one of the advantages to doing a virtual panel.
Which is much better than me trying to summarize like my general thoughts on
Mm-hmm.
it.
We so before we started recording the panel, Ellie and I were talking about Mary Shelley, and I went ahead and looked her up on Wikipedia. Her Wikipedia page is just it is one tragedy after another. Her mother died a month after she was born. Her father was an anarchist, which is I did not know that. Very interesting. Percy Shelley was married when they hooked up, and she
Yep.
got pregnant. And Percy's wife, it did not go well for her. That's all I will say on this particular panel is Percy's first wife didn't go well. So Mary Shelley's life is this great tragedy from the beginning, and I think that what Ellie and I were catching on to here earlier was that all this angst and passion and family relationship problems, all this kind of Freudian stuff going on in Frankenstein is honestly come by. It's part of her life. She didn't have to travel too far to find how to feel emotional anguish and pain and loss. Ellie, does that pretty much cover what you were wanting?
Yeah, pretty much, but also like her calling it the modern Prometheus in general is
Yes.
also another reflection of how she intended this story to come out. Because like with Prometheus, the creation of fire and the gift of fire, it could be used for creation and for survival, or it could be used as destruction. And it sometimes can be out of our control. We can do our best to control it, but once it starts, it can rage on, and there's no stopping it. So I think that idea really flows into the whole what we create. If we create these beings like AI these days, it's AI or androids or whatever you want to call it these days. That is a thing. It has this one gift of creation of life. On the other hand, it could be destruction. It could be our own destruction. And once it starts, there will not be any controlling it. Or if we do, it's going to be very difficult because fire is hot. It burns you if you try and touch it. So, on the one hand, it just goes through those very, those really conflicting duality themes of, yin and yang and all that. But it's so easy to see how she would struggle with that internally based on what she went through in her life. Because that's a lot of strife to go through, and that's a lot of moral issues to face. And so I totally see why she thought of this based on all that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we need to pay the bills and get out of here. Any parting shots before we start shutting this thing down? No? Okay. All right, then let's do this. First of all, thank you everybody. That was a great discussion. I was really pleased with how that turned out. What I want to do is ask you to tell us where our audience members can find you on the interwebs. Ellie, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Okay. You can find me at ellierain.com or necroscene.com.
Excellent. James, where can we track you down?
JamesPalmerBooks.net.
Excellent. And I'm Darren Bush again, even though it says I'm Monsteramacon. My name is Darren Bush. You can find my Kindle ebooks. Oh, hello. You can find my Kindle books on my author's page on Amazon. And I want to quickly also say, don't forget that Virtual Monsterama 2020 is benefiting the MPTF, the Motion Picture and Television Fund, which provides temporary financial assistance for needs created or complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more and to donate, and please donate, go to mptf.com. That's mptf.com. And I just want to personally add that I appreciate what our sponsor is doing, because these people make the art that we're talking about today and all weekend. So please support them. Anyway, Ellie, James, thank you so much for being here. We're going to say goodbye to Virtual Monsterama 2020. Wave goodbye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.